What's going on, guys? It's Nick here, back with another video. We'll be doing a similar setup to yesterday's video, so I'll be going over some wide receivers on teams that have really good or really bad playoff matchups, and then I will touch on some wide receivers that you guys asked for an updated take on. But before we do that, have to start things off as usual with the stat of the day. Yesterday's stat was which quarterback with at least 150 pass attempts currently has the highest percent of aggressive throws, and the answer is Joe Burrow. And Sir Kruniak was the first to get that one right. Today's stat: what wide receiver led the league in air yards in both Week 8 and in Week 9? All right, so when we are looking at matchups in the fantasy playoffs, there are a number of teams that we want to be attacking, but a handful that stand out as just incredible spots. One is Seattle. That is the prize. If you are playing Seattle as a wide receiver, that is the single best spot you can possibly have for floor and upside. An elite wide receiver going up against Seattle is going to have a good game. There are very few cases where that just does not happen. They've had just this incredible combination of a relatively strong run defense, but a historically bad pass defense. So they are just the top pass funnel we can look for. Atlanta is also a big pass funnel. Remember, they're pretty solid at defending running back production on the ground, but they struggle mightily against the pass. We've got the Vikings. They give up a ton of production to opposing wide receivers, and especially opposing wide receiver ones. Dallas, of course, we know is a great matchup. Their entire defense is pretty bad. The Jets are a really big pass funnel. They have a decent run defense. It's not that great, but at least it's better than their pass defense. And we saw Cam Newton was just horrendous for a pretty large stretch of time, and then he just rips apart that defense. So they are definitely a defense we should attack. And then we have the Texans and the Patriots. Those both defend on Roby and Gilmore. So if those two are active, then these aren't as good of matchups to attack, at least for opposing wide receiver ones. If those two are out, these defenses are absolutely trash at defending wide receivers. And so that's something to where we can't really know their status come the fantasy playoffs, but I want to note that. If you see a matchup against Houston and the Patriots, it could be very, very good, depending on are they the wide receiver 1 or 2, and then, of course, are Gilmore and Roby active. But these are the defense that you definitely want to attack. But we're mainly going to focus on Seattle, Atlanta, Minnesota, and Dallas as just the 4 dream matchups, with, again, Seattle being the prize. So the number 1 team that we're looking at for the best matchups in the fantasy playoffs is the Rams. Weeks 14, 15, and 16, they get the Patriots, Jets, and Seattle Seahawks in the fantasy championships. We actually get a preview of this Seattle matchup this week. So if you do want to do a trade for Cooper Kupp or Robert Woods, then you might want to do that before this Sunday, because they get this perfect matchup. They're both probably going to have incredible games. And so not only would you miss out on that if you trade for them next week, but their value is going to go way up. We see Cooper Kupp had 20 targets last week. If he goes off again this week, you're not getting him. Same thing with Robert Woods. He didn't have 20 targets, but he had a decent game last week. If he goes off for 152 scores this week, you're not getting him. So I think right now is just a really good time to trade for both Kupp and Woods if you are in the market for an upgrade at that position. Unfortunately, Seattle plays the Jets in Week 14 and the football team in Week 15. So I was really, really hoping that I would look at the schedule and I would see, 3 great matchups. But unfortunately, the Jets are going to have a really good game against Seattle. Yes, the football team is. Of course, Terry McLaurin is probably going to have a great game, but I was hoping for a little bit better matchups for those. But again, football team and Jets are going to also play Seattle in the fantasy playoffs, so keep that in mind if you're doing trades. The Bears get to face Houston, Minnesota, and Jacksonville. So remember, Houston kind of depends on Roby, but then Minnesota and Jacksonville are fantastic matchups. So Allen Robinson, I've been mentioning Allen Robinson for a few weeks now, so you guys already know that he ends the season with a very, very strong schedule, and I guess strong as in weak, very strong in the sense that we really like his schedule, but he's got really, really soft matchups, so he should perform really well. The Bengals, they get to play Dallas and Houston in weeks 14 and 16, so those are very good matchups. But then Pittsburgh in week 15, so it's a little bit of a split there. Higgins and Boyd should be great in 2 of your 3 matchups in the fantasy playoffs, but that week 15 Look at your team. I mean, you should be game planning what it is right now. Look at week 15. Does the rest of your lineup kind of have solid production to where you could say trade for Higgins or Boyd and then in week 15 bench them against Pittsburgh, but have those matchups in 14 and 16? That's something only you can know, but I wanted to definitely bring that up because those are really good matchups. Other than that, the Bucs, they get to play the Vikings, Falcons, and Lions. Those are three really nice matchups. I went over Fournette in yesterday's video, so you guys have already heard my spiel about how these are games where even if the matchup wasn't elite, which for the wide receivers, it's really, really nice matchups. But even if they weren't elite matchups, these are games that we expect to be high scoring. We should expect, I would say maybe the Lions game could be a blowout, but I would think that all these games are going to be relatively close and high scoring. And that's exactly what we want for fantasy production. So the Bucs playoff schedule is awesome. I know probably all of you watched that Sunday night game and you know that it was just an embarrassing performance for the entire Bucs offense. But you probably also noticed how good Antonio Brown looked. I mean, it didn't show up in the box score, but if you were watching that game and you had Antonio Brown on your roster, you're feeling pretty good, right? I mean, he looked very good. It didn't look like he'd taken a step backwards. It looked like Tom Brady is like, yeah, I got Antonio Brown back. I've got someone really nice to throw to. Obviously, Godwin and Mike Evans are as well, but we know Mike Evans can kind of take a hiatus at times, and we know Godwin's been struggling through injuries this season, and so having all three of them is awesome. But I have gotten a lot of questions of, well, okay, but how do we rank them? And I went over that last week. I think after watching this game, it kind of confirms what I thought. I really think it's going to come down to Antonio Brown and Godwin as the top two in terms of most valuable wide receiver on this offense, with Mike Evans being a little bit behind them just because he's much more inconsistent in the production. They were all bad this week, so you can't really look at this week, and the targets are actually very similar for all of them, but I really think over time it's going to be between Brown and Godwin, and it's going to come down to who scores more touchdowns, which we can't really know. If you want to know rest of season, I have Godwin, wide receiver 17, Brown, wide receiver 21, and then Mike Evans, wide receiver 25. I really don't think there's a huge gap between any of them, but I really do believe Mike Evans is the least valuable of that group, especially when Antonio Brown gets ramped up more and more. There's a very real chance that Antonio Brown is the most valuable. Again, though, right now, just given the history with Brady and slot receivers, not that they're not going to play Antonio Brown in the slot, but Godwin is going to man the slot more often than not. I think that Godwin would be my favorite among the bunch, but I think all of them basically wide receiver twos, with Evans being a little bit lower. Those are all like the really good matchups. I didn't see any other teams that it's like, oh my goodness, they've got, two dream spots and a tough one, or like three really nice spots. Everyone else was kind of middle of the pack. We're not really looking too much at their schedule. But we do have a few teams that have pretty bad playoff schedules. The Seahawks and the Falcons definitely stand out, but it's worth noting that the players on these teams are pretty largely matchup proof. And so like you're not trading Julio Jones, you're not trading Metcalf, you're probably not trading away Tyler Lockett. And so it's something to keep in mind that Seattle and the Falcons, they do have difficult matchups, but it's just something to keep in mind. I'm not sitting there like, oh no, have to get rid of Metcalf. I'm not trading away Metcalf for basically anything other than like a top 5 running back. He's going to be extremely valuable. He's got the ceiling to go off for 150 and 3 scores in any matchup. I mean, look what he just did to Tre'Davious White. I mean, Tre'Davious White is one of the best lockdown corners in the league, and he was being shadowed by him. He still had, what was it? I don't even remember, but it was like 7 for 105 and a touchdown, something like that. He is an absolute freak. You're not trading him for anything. I just want to bring up that these teams have pretty difficult matchups. 3 teams where it's going to matter more are the Vikings, the Panthers, and the Jaguars. So Minnesota faces the Bucs, Bears, and Saints. Carolina faces the Broncos, Packers, and football team. And then the Jaguars face the Titans, Ravens, and Bears. The 2 potential sell highs from that kind of trio of teams are Chark and Curtis Samuel. Samuel is coming off back-to-back big games, whereas Chark is coming off won, but it was a really nice game. I don't consider either of them like a must sell. If you own these guys, it's not like gotta get rid of them now that they're producing. I don't think that at all. But if you were considering it before, I think that looking at their playoff schedule, it's definitely a possibility that you should consider. Especially, Curtis Samuel, he was extremely inefficient last season. It was almost like a joke that he had so many air yards and so many targets and just no production from it. Then you flip to this season, he's caught 88% of his targets on the season, including 96% of his targets since week 5. He's not going to catch 96% of his targets moving forward, and his 4 touchdowns over the last few weeks is very unsustainable. And again, you don't need to trade him, but his value is very high right now, and considering that playoff schedule, it's not the worst idea to move him if someone really wants him in your league. And then again, Chark also not a must-sell, like I said, but he faces the Packers and the Steelers up next, and then like I said, the Ravens and the Bears in the semifinals and finals. So while he could absolutely have good games in these matchups, it's less likely than on average, and so maybe his value is a little high right now. Maybe you can flip him for something else that you need. If he's maybe an ancillary piece, that would be the biggest thing for your team. If he's someone that is kind of on the fringe of who you're starting, but you need an upgrade at tight end, you need an upgrade at quarterback or running back, well, maybe you use Chark to upgrade those positions. Just a thought. That's it for playoff schedules. Now I want to go over all these wide receivers you guys wanted updated takes on. So the list that I tweeted out a question, I've looked in the comment section. The most common players you're asking about: DJ Moore, Marquise Brown, a comparison between Diontae Johnson and Claypool, like who is more valuable rest of season. Jakobi Meyers, what's his value? And then Terry McLaurin, because you're concerned about the quarterback change. So we'll go over those, and then if you have any other players in mind, remember that I answer more of your questions in the Saturday video, so either tweet them at me or leave them in the comment section here, and I'll try to answer even more of those then. So first up, we have everyone's favorite, DJ Moore. I mentioned last week that his production had stabilized with his volume, so he wasn't getting unlucky, he wasn't getting lucky, he was performing exactly to that point in the season how he should. It's the exact same this season. He's 35th in targets per game, 34th in air yards per game, 36th in fantasy points per game. What he's been doing on average throughout the season is what you should expect. Now, he is coming off of his 2 worst games of the season. So that doesn't mean that these last 2 weeks are what we should expect. It's if you averaged out his production over the season, that's what we should expect each week on average. So his value right now is probably a little bit lower than we would expect, right? When someone has through week 9 their second worst game of the season and then their worst game of the season, obviously we're going to see a dip in value, and we look at what he did in weeks 2 through 7. Well, he was the wide receiver 10 through that stretch, but these last 2 weeks have been absolutely brutal for him as they've leaned on Curtis Samuel more and more in these last 2 weeks. This last week isn't very surprising. I did highlight DJ Moore as one of the players in week 9 that had the most difficult matchup among any wide receiver. And I did say I would be benching him in the one league where I had him. And we have 2 flex spots. I was starting 4 wide receivers ahead of him. And I talked about one of the receivers I didn't even feel that good about, but I had no confidence in DJ Moore last week. So his production wasn't at all surprising. It was definitely disappointing that he played poorly, but it wasn't surprising. I still have the same take as last week. If you own him, there's no point in selling him for a discount. You're not going to get anything for DJ Moore right now, so I wouldn't even consider trade offers. They're definitely going to be way too low. But if you don't own him and you really, really want him, I don't think anyone should really, really want him at this point in the season. He's definitely not performing how we would have hoped. But if you are someone who thinks, Nick, I understand he's not exceptional, but he is free in my league, we'll go after him. If he's free in your league, he's definitely someone who has the talent, has the opportunity to perform. You can go after him if he's very cheap and you want a slight upgraded position. It's only going to cost you some bench players. So that's how I view it. Don't have to trade him away. Wouldn't trade him away. And then you don't have to trade for him. But if you want to, go for it. Next up, we've got Hollywood Brown, and he currently ranks 49th in targets per game, 13th in air yards per game, and only 51st in fantasy points per game. Brown is actually really interesting. So he started off with very, very consistent volume. He was getting between like 6 and 8 targets every single week and was typically among the league leaders in air yards. And so to start the season, it was like, this is awesome. He's gonna hit at some point. But he never really did, and he just wasn't connecting on any deep throws. Now, on that front, I want to make sure you guys are clear. It is not Marquise Brown's fault. It has been Lamar Jackson. Brown is getting wide open deep a lot this season, and he should be producing really well, but Lamar has been off. Let's just put it what it is. This offense has performed poorly compared to last season because of Lamar Jackson. He has not been as good. He was definitely on the high end of variance last season. I don't know if teams have figured him out. I don't know if he's regressed as far as passing. But Marquise Brown is wide open a lot deep downfield, and he just can't connect with Lamar Jackson, and that's not the wide receiver's fault. When the wide receiver's wide open deep downfield, it's the quarterback's fault for not getting him the ball. So I want to make sure you guys aren't like super upset with Marquise Brown. The person you want to be upset with is Lamar Jackson, because he needs to be better throwing him deep. So he was seeing, really consistent volume, but that's dipped in these last 2 weeks. He had 2 targets in week 8 and then 5 targets in week 9. But look at who he faced. I mean, he faced the Steelers and the Colts, and those are 2 really difficult matchups. But even look before that, he faced Kansas City, Washington, Cincy, and Philly. So we see Kansas City and Washington, those are both bottom 5 matchups for wide receivers. The Eagles are the single most difficult matchup for opposing wide receiver ones. And so in the last 6 weeks, or last 6 games that he's played, he's had 5 brutal matchups. And so it's not shocking that he hasn't performed exceptionally. And given the one soft matchup, he went 6 for 77 and a touchdown on 10 targets. I mean, if he had a bunch of soft matchups, he'd be crushing right now. But he's had tough matchups, and so he hasn't been. And he's not really one of those wide receivers who typically is going to outperform the matchup. And so he's not Julio Jones, DK Metcalf. He's not someone like that that can just win physically against even elite corners, elite defenses, and command this massive target share. His targets are going to drop. He is not going to just get wide open in the intermediate area of the field against difficult opponents. He can get wide open deep, but that's going to happen less against really good defenses. And so when we look moving forward, what are his matchups? Well, in week 12, he has to play Pittsburgh again, so we're not expecting him to do well in that matchup. But that's it. Every other week, he's got a relatively soft matchup, assuming the game with the Patriots, Gilmore is out. But if Gilmore is out again for that game, it's an extremely soft matchup. We saw what Perriman and Mims were able to do against the Patriots on Monday night. But he's got really nice matchups moving forward, and so I don't really see his value ever getting cheaper than it is right now. And so if you want someone with that weekly ceiling, Marquise Brown is a good guy to go after in the trade market. Next up, we've got that question. Diontae Johnson, Chase Claypool, who's more valuable rest of season? It is kind of hard to determine that. I'll say that last week was a little bit odd. The Steelers used 3 wide receiver sets on an insanely high percentage of their plays, and that resulted in Diontae, Claypool, and Juju all playing over 80% of the snaps. I don't expect that to happen every week, but I expect them to all be high. I mean, they want all 3 of these guys on the field because they're awesome. I mean, all 3 of these guys, I know I have talked a little bit about Juju not being as great in fantasy this season just because of how good Claypool and Diontae are, but Juju's still a really good wide receiver. Claypool is an exceptional young receiver. Diontae is amazing. I mean, if Claypool hadn't been emerging, just imagine how many targets Diontae would be getting. So this is a fantastic wide receiver core. And so if you're coaching this team, yeah, you want all these guys on the field, especially because they complement each other. Juju is really, really good in the slot and not so good on the outside. Well, when you have 2 great people on the outside, it just complements everything beautifully. You've got Claypool downfield, you've got the target hog in Diontae, you've got Juju in the slot. Like, it is a great combination of receivers. But for fantasy, what do we think rest of the season? In the 4 games that Diontae Johnson has played, the entire game, started and finished healthy, his targets are 10, 13, 15, and 10. He is very clearly a target monster on this offense. Now, while he doesn't have that same sort of explosiveness that Claypool has, Almost no one has that sort of explosiveness. I still view Diontae Johnson as the more valuable wide receiver rest of season. So if we're going into a neutral matchup, I would prefer to have Diontae on my team because I want that double-digit targets. I mean, every single week that this dude is healthy, he's getting double-digit targets. That does not mean that Claypool is not good or not valuable. He's been amazing. He's going to stay very valuable. I just slightly prefer Diontae. So I think Diontae, wide receiver 22 rest of the season. Claypool, wide receiver 28. I have not gone through and updated everything for this week, so that might change a little bit. But I kind of looked through, and the wide receiver 20 through 30 rest of the season is effectively all the exact same wide receiver. I mean, their values are unbelievably close to each other. So could they fluctuate in that range? Sure. But I do think asking the question, Diontae or Claypool, it's Diontae because I trust his target share to be very, very consistent. Whereas Claypool might spike a little bit more up and down because his targets do come deep downfield. He might have those weeks where he's only 3 for 50. Whereas Diontae, he's going to be very, very consistent. And I do like that because, of course, you know, Diontae also has like 10, 11 reception upside in these weeks. So it's not like he doesn't have the ceiling. You guys also wanted an update on Jakobi Meyers. I mean, he's been emerging in this Patriots offense. And of course, as a Patriots fan, you might want my take on that. I have honestly just always loved this kid. Every time, whether it's in the preseason, whether it's when they've had injuries, whenever they've given him any sort of snap share, any sort of opportunity, he's produced. I truly believe that he is a better wide receiver than N'Keal Harry. Maybe at some point Harry is going to be good, but I think Jakobi Meyers is better than N'Keal Harry, and I don't think that should be a hot take. I think it's only a hot take because of where Harry was drafted. He was supposed to be really good. He's just not. At this point, even when Harry returns, I don't see how the Patriots could look at this production from Meyers and possibly bench him. I really don't think how you could possibly do that. And so I think he is a fantasy starter moving forward, especially while Harry and Edelman are out. I haven't done the rankings for this week yet, but I would be surprised if he's not in that wide receiver 2 range. And that might sound high. That might sound like it's a little bit unrealistic to think Jakobi Meyers is a wide receiver 2 moving forward. But have you watched him play? I mean, watch Cam. I think that's the biggest thing. It's not necessarily that Jakobi Meyers is like the greatest wide receiver ever. But when Cam drops back, he's only looking at Meyers. And it's just like he doesn't even have a second read a lot of the time. The second read is right now Damiere Byrd. When Edelman comes back, that second read will shift into Edelman. But it's Meyers. He just is in love with Jakobi Meyers. And given that he keeps getting open and given that it keeps working, why would they switch that up in the offense? So I do believe while Edelman and Harry are out, Meyers is the wide receiver 2. Even when some of those guys return, I think he's going to be valuable in fantasy. And so I know that he's on free agency in a ton of leagues. You got to go out and get him. And I think you could easily start him rest of season. The final wide receiver we'll go over today is Terry McLaurin. You guys wanted to take on, his quarterback just got hurt again. He's got that carousel at quarterback. Is his production going to go down? No, I don't think that at all. I think that Kyle Allen should not be considered a great quarterback. Alex Smith is still good enough to get the ball to Terry McLaurin. McLaurin leads all wide receivers in share of team air yards. He's second behind only Devonta Adams in opportunity rating, weighted opportunity rating this season. He is an elite wide receiver. He was an elite wide receiver last season. He's improved a little this season. He is a fantastic wide receiver, and Alex Smith is going to pepper him with targets. So do not be worried that Kyle Allen's out and now it's Alex Smith. He's still going to get the targets. He's still going to be great. So I hope that was helpful for you guys. Again, if you have any further questions, tweet them at me or leave them as a comment in this video, and I will try to go over the most asked questions in the Saturday video. That's the end of this one. Hope you guys did enjoy. If you did, then how about hitting that like button? And how about subscribing to the channel if you're new? Thanks for watching.